on climate indicators and torture in Africa. During the course of this presentation, I will be looking at how climate change affects torture rates in order to perhaps identify additional negative social consequences of global warming. There are two theoretical explanations that I will cover in this presentation. One being the economic pathway theory, and the second is the aggressive behavior theory. Using the ordinary least squared regression, the results showed a statistically significant correlation between temperature increments and the frequency of torture practices in Africa. So you may wonder, where in the world did I get the idea that climate change has anything to do with torture rates? Well, during my sophomore year, I took a course with Professor Satyanet in international politics, and according to one of his empirical studies that he presented, he proposed that rising temperature tends to increase the risk of civil war in sub-Saharan Africa. His theory was based on the notion that the increase in average temperature negatively affects agricultural yields, which then lower the opportunity cost for people to join rebel groups. This makes sense when you consider the impact that climate change can have on Africa's agriculturally dependent economy. His study sparked my curiosity during my sophomore year, and I began to wonder how the government would react in the light of the situation. Would they overlook in apathy or undertake politically oppressive measures on its people? If governments do indeed opt to the latter option, I reason that torture would definitely be a fair factor to consider for, as past literature has demonstrated torture as a political tool of oppression. Climate records for Africa in the 20th century has shown a warming of approximately 0.07 degrees Celsius, or 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit for those who are Americans. The increase in temperature continues to occur even to this day as a result of global warming that many of you guys are already aware of. This climate change is detrimental to Africa because more than 50% of their GDP and 90% of their employment is derived from this agricultural sector. The majority of people who reside in rural parts of Africa, they derive 60 to 100% of their income from agriculturally related activities. When these facts are taken into consideration, it is quite intelligible to see that a rise in average temperature will have a big impact on Africa's agriculturally dependent economy. My first theory proposes that climate change impacts torture rates in Africa with the economy acting as the pathway. So basically, when climate change deters Africa's economy, the lack of resources, unemployment, and poverty will lower people's opportunity cost for opposing the government. And in return, what will the government do? The government will increase the use of torture as a political tool to oppress its people in order to regain control. My second theory proposes that climate change impacts torture rates in Africa as a result of the temperature aggression theory. This approach goes deeper into this approach attempts to gain a deeper understanding of the psychological conditions under which individuals function during hotter days. The temperature aggression theory states that hotter temperature leads to greater discomfort, basically becoming more cranky, which in turn gives rise to more aggressive behavior. For example, in the case of arbitrary arrests or detentions, higher temperatures can make prison guards more aggressive towards the detainees, and thus practicing torture more frequently, even under unnecessary conditions. Therefore, basically, according to this theory, I expect higher temperatures to be correlated with higher torture rates in Africa. Sorry, this room is really dry. Does that make you crazy?
It's about really soon.
So, how do I test this? My first hypothesis is that the increase in average temperature will correlate with the increase in torture levels in Africa. This initial hypothesis will show whether if temperature is in fact even related to torture rates. After testing for this theory, I take a minor departure from the model assumption, and change the dependent variable to physical integrity, to government's respect for physical integrity rights to test for data robustness. If my theory holds true for torture levels, then temperature should also have the opposite effect on the government's respect for physical integrity, as physical integrity is just an additive index of violent political tools, such as torture, extrajudicial killings, political imprisonment, and disappearances. I test the second hypothesis with economic control variables included to see if the positive correlation between temperature and torture is as a result of the economic pathway theory. If there is not much of a difference between the first hypothesis and the second one, then it gives stronger support to the temperature aggression theory, as you will see that the economy doesn't have much effect on torture rates. For this cross-sectional time series data of 41 African countries spanning from years 1981 to 2002, my ordered probit regression model observes annual data for each country. Furthermore, I used the ordinary least squared regression with robust standard errors to test for my hypothesis. And lastly, I applied country fixed effects to my model because I recognize that each country has its own individual characteristics that may or may not affect the dependent and the independent variables. This allowed my model to basically remove the effect of time invariant characteristics to clearly assess the relationship between temperature and torture. So my data, the main dependent variable, torture and physical integrity rights, are taken from the Singranelli and Richards Human Rights Data Project, which uses standardized qualitative information taken from the annual U.S. State Department's country report on human rights, and also the Amnesty International's annual report to Code for Human Rights Variables. Siri rates actual number of government practices and uses the ordinal level of measurement, since accurate number of human rights violations are very difficult to assess. And it uses the latitude provided by this ordinal score categories to allow for measurement error resulting from the qualitative information that the scores are based. The independent variable, the temperature, this consists of time series average temperature levels of all months within a given year. The data is taken from Professor Satyanith's empirical study, warming increases risk of civil war in Africa. It was an easy way of gathering data. Just to point that out. And he derives his data from the climatic research unit of the University of Anglia, which is located in the UK. So for my control variables include things like polity, transparency, whether countries have signed the Convention Against Torture, and other components that I thought may influence the predictor variables. These control variables are placed to see temperature's net effect on torture under similar conditions. Table 1 explores the effect of average temperature on torture and physical integrity rights without any economic variables. The coefficient for average temperature shows that it is strongly correlated with torture rates at the 5% level with a statistically significant p-value of 2.41. As for physical integrity rights, the coefficient for average temperature is negative 0.323 at the 10% significance level, implying that government respect for these rights actually may worsen as temperature rises. This result is in sync with the widely accepted temperature aggression theory and empirical studies that were conducted in the past to observe the relationship between heat and aggressive behavior. Now, table 2. This shows the results when economic variables are controlled. The general results of the two hypotheses are actually quite similar. And there is only a slight increase in torture rates once GDP per capita and GDP per capita's annual percentage growth are controlled. The coefficients for average temperature show that it is still strongly correlated with torture at the 5% level, and with a significant p-value of 2.07. So controlling for these economic variables yielded a lower rate of torture and higher respect for human rights, for physical integrity rights. This suggests the possibility that in Africa, economic factors may, in fact, act as a pathway for climate to influence torture. But the differences, as you can see, are so minimal that the results do not give a very strong support for the economic pathway theory. And furthermore, one cannot ignore the notion of multicollinearity having effect in the variables, which changes the outcome. Summary of my results. The results show that hotter temperature is actually positively correlated with increased practices of torture and negatively correlated with respect towards physical integrity rights, which I hypothesized. Under these results, I suggest that the temperature aggression theory holds a stronger ground, and perhaps this can be one of the explanations for the overall outcome of my study. But surprisingly, in contrast to the economic pathway theory that I researched a lot into, GDP per capita and the annual percentage growth, they're not statistically significant to torture and have minimal effects on the other control variables, unfortunately.
Hey, that's science, right? There's going to be wrong sometimes.
That's science, but I wanted to develop something new, explore something I was critical. But so for this reason, the economic pathway theory loses much of its weight for the purpose of this study. In the beginning of this presentation, I rationalized that lower agricultural yields due to increased temperature would significantly raise the cases of government-instigated torture levels in Africa. However, this was not the case. And maybe I should have considered the possibility that increases in temperature may not significantly worsen the already devastating levels of poverty in Africa, or the fact that society has the ability to adapt to different environmental changes. Nonetheless, the implications of this study strongly supports the notion that heat does increase aggressive motivation, thus adding to the negative social consequences of global warming. Thank you.
Like a well-owned Grand Prix Formula One pit crew, we're now going to in exactly 18 seconds from one setup to another.
Oh well.